Hi everyone and welcome to Lesson 5, Cinematic Dialogue. Let's go ahead and start with a quick definition of what I mean by cinematic dialogue. So, hopefully you know that dialogue refers to speaking like a conversation, and we've used the word cinematic before. So, cinematic dialogue refers to dialogue that adds to the story instead of just taking up space. Sometimes when people insert dialogue into their story, that dialogue, those characters talking or those people talking, that dialogue just sort of takes up space in their story. It really doesn't add to the story. It doesn't really subtract from the story, but it's just kind of boring. It doesn't really add to the story. So whenever we use dialogue in our story, we want it to be special. We want it to be like frosting on top of the cake. It needs to be special in some ways, otherwise it's just taking up space. So the question is, how exactly can we do that? How can we create dialogue in our stories that actually adds to the story? So I'd like to do this by showing you some examples of bad dialogue and then better dialogue. So let's go ahead and start with an example of bad dialogue. I'll just go ahead and put this on screen and you can read through it. Hopefully you agree with me that it's quite bad dialogue. It's very boring. It's easy to predict. It's very plain. It really doesn't add to the story. I'll give you a second to read through that. If you need to pause the video, go ahead and do that. So obviously a very boring dialogue in this story. It would be a much better idea to turn this dialogue into just regular writing. If you don't have to write dialogue, if it would be more concise just to tell what happened, then go ahead and do that. So I've turned that whole conversation into something much more concise and much more interesting. So a simple sentence. So the moral we can learn from that first example is that if you don't have to use dialogue, don't. If it's in general, it's much easier to communicate things through just regular writing. Only use dialogue when absolutely necessary, and as we learned at the beginning of this lesson, only when it would really add to the story. There are a lot of different ways that you can tell a story, and sometimes if something is really amazing and you want to highlight it, then maybe dialogue would be a great way of doing that. But most of the time, it's much more concise just to write it out in regular words. So I think that's a lesson we can learn from that first example. Let's go ahead and look at another example. So if you need to pause the video so you can read through this, go ahead and do that. Okay, so this is actually also a bad example for several reasons. First of all, notice in the first sentence we have the word sleepily, asked Cindy sleepily. Now, I personally don't like adverbs very much. I think that you can be a lot more descriptive if you use actual action or actual description. So in other words, instead of saying asked Cindy sleepily, wouldn't it sound much better to say asked Cindy with a yawn? I think that's much more descriptive. You can picture it in your head much better than just sleepily. So that's the first thing I don't like about this dialogue. Also, notice how long this second bit of conversation is. Does anyone really talk like that? Does anyone really have really long, detailed sentences like this? Not really. That sounds more like a speech. And in order to make dialogue sound realistic, you generally don't have speeches in the middle of your dialogue. So that's something else to keep in mind when you are inserting dialogue into your story. Don't have one character or one person go on and on and on. Most of the time it goes back and forth very quickly. All right, one more thing. Notice that there are fancy verbs for each of these sentences. We have asked Cindy, mused Claire, and returned Cindy. Now, if you want to draw attention to those verbs, then go ahead and use them. But if you're just trying to put the focus all on the actual words that were spoken, then I would recommend not using fancy verbs. You might think that's a little bit different. It's kind of fun to use fancy verbs, but they actually can be distracting from the actual words that were spoken. So don't use fancy verbs unless you're trying to draw attention to them. So just 3 things that we can learn from this bad example of dialogue. And in the next screen, you'll see how I corrected it and hopefully made it a little bit better. So in the first sentence, you can see how I'd made Cindy actually doing something instead of just saying that she was sleepy. Most of the time, I just use the regular word said. Said Claire, said Cindy. It's a lot more natural sounding. No one's giving a long speech. And one more thing I wanted to point out. Notice how between these last 3 lines, there's a little bit of tension there, or it's not like the answers are very predictable. In the first bad example I gave to you, it was very predictable what the next person would say. In this example, I tried to make it so that you didn't quite know how the other person would respond. So notice how Claire says, "Me neither, I just started, but I might quit soon." And then how the next character says boring, asking if she's thinking that Claire wants to quit just because it's boring. And then Claire answers back, no, it's because Canvas is so expensive. So that's a lot better than in the previous example where we had Claire giving this long speech about how she started painting and how much canvas costs and how it's getting more expensive. It's just really boring that way. When it's broken up like this and there's a little bit of mystery, or we don't know what the other person's going to say next, when we have that kind of mystery, it actually creates really interesting dialogue and it adds to the story instead of just taking up space. So just to kind of review, there were 5 keys to cinematic dialogue, 5 tips that will help you make dialogue that actually adds to your story. So first of all, use dialogue when it's the best way to share what happened. If there's a better way of sharing what happened, maybe just using regular sentences, then go for that. Only use dialogue when it's the best way to share what happened. Secondly, try not to say obvious things in dialogue. You could probably skip the "hi, how are you" part of dialogue. That's just kind of boring, and no one really wants to read that. So try not to say obvious things and obvious answers in dialogue. Thirdly, only use special verbs when you want to draw attention to them, otherwise just use said. And fourthly, try to use action instead of adverbs to paint a picture of how the speakers are speaking. Adverbs are kind of like shortcuts. They kind of do the job, but actually describing the actions of the characters does a lot better job. And lastly, use dialogue like salt. If you put dialogue in every sentence, it will begin to be too salty and taste disgusting. So use it like salt. Just use a little here, a little there, and it'll make your overall story taste better. But too much makes it taste gross. So less is more. So these are the 5 keys to cinematic dialogue, and I hope that they are helpful to you. They'd be good to keep in mind or to write down somewhere when you are completing today's assignments. So speaking of assignments, let's go ahead and go over them, continue watching this video lesson. And secondly, we're going to do something fun today. We're going to make a comic. Since we're talking about dialogue, I thought it would be fun to make a comic. And the topic for today is something funny that happened to you. So making a funny comic. And to do that, I have a link posted on the website, but you'll go to this website. It's fairly easy to use. There aren't a whole lot of characters, but you can choose a character. Let's say you want this character. Choose a position and see how it will pop into that window. And let's give him something to say. So here comes talk balloons. You can choose which shape. Click this to move it. Need this to resize it. And then you can type. Whatever you want to say. I'm just making something up. Then you can go to the next frame, choose your next character. You can, again, scale it, make it bigger or smaller, depending on what you want to do. You can also add props. So if you want to have a baby, lots of money in the background, you could do that. You could add an umbrella. You can do whatever you want, and don't forget to put dialogue balloons in your story, since we're focusing on dialogue. And you can change the background color. You can do whatever you want. So basically, just have fun, and remember the purpose of this fun activity is to work on the dialogue. So really make sure that your dialogue tries to follow those 5 principles of cinematic dialogue. So let's say that you're finished now with your comic, and you're ready to submit it. So I believe you clicked next, and here you can put your name and your email. I'm just putting my information, and then you can send a copy to yourself, and then also send a copy to me at tuneup@gmail.com. That way I can get a copy of that and try to post that on the website so everyone can see what everyone else did. So this will be a fun activity. Looks like you can also print it and go back and edit it or create another one. So click email, and it says your email recipient will receive your message and a link to view your comics. So that's perfect, and that will send it to me as well as to yourself so that you can view your comic later. So that's how you create the comic. Hopefully you'll have fun with that. Then we also have our regular writing assignment. So also write an 8-sentence story about that same funny thing that happened to you. So you'll have a story version of that funny time as well as a comic version of that funny time. And I know that the comic creation program doesn't have characters for every type of person, so just kind of do your best. It's just supposed to be funny anyway. So just a little note on that. Next, post your work on the website as usual, leave 2 encouraging comments, and submit your progress report. Okay, so in summary, we focused on cinematic dialogue today. Remember, cinematic dialogue actually says something. It actually adds to the story. It doesn't just take up space. And also, I would encourage you to think of dialogue like poetry. We kind of talked about this earlier. You don't want to just fill up your conversations with useless words. You want to think very concisely, and you want to write very concisely, kind of like a poet would do with his or her poem. They don't just choose random words. They think really hard about the best word that would be for each line. So in the same way, think of your dialogue like poetry, and choose the best words and don't waste your words. So that summarizes our lesson on cinematic dialogue. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope everyone has fun with today's assignments.